Test one, two, test one, two.
Test, does this work? Right? I think so, right? All right, because this is to make sure that the YouTube like it catches sound on YouTube on the YouTube. Right? Oh, okay, okay. So that's good. Yeah.
And I can turn you up on the fly if I need to.
Okay, sounds great. Yeah, you just do whatever that's necessary.
I will be up here.
Uh-huh.
So you know, like kind of operating some of this stuff.
Sounds great. Thank you so much. And I don't need to like hit this again if I want to use this, right? Or if it doesn't work, I'll just okay, just like
You should be good to go.
okay, sounds great. Thank you so much. Hello back. I just came back from Notre Dame yesterday at like 7 p.m. I spent 20 hours in the airport or on the plane for the past 3 days. So there's a delay, and then Notre Dame like there's no direct flight, so it's just a lot of no. I mean it's just.
The better question is how are you here, not how am I here.
I'm fine. I'm still in one piece. And I got back. So yeah. So that's first it. Yeah.
We can start whenever you're ready. We can give it a couple more minutes too. I don't know. I'm playing Nancy.
Oh, Lacey.
So, you guys tell me. What should we do?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, right. Sorry. Sometimes my hair. Oh, there we go. Is it good?
So I'll enter you, and then you can run Q&A because it's a small enough room.
Okay.
You just want to talk.
Sounds great. Sounds perfect.
All good? Are we good here? You guys are good? Okay.
Yes. Because some of these students, yeah. So we had 8 students that signed up. Everything's going great. So.
Okay. Hi, folks. Welcome to today's CISSM forum. I am doing best impersonation of Nancy Gallagher today, so you will probably all be very disappointed, but your loss is my gain because I get to introduce a very old friend and one of, in my view, the best China scholars out there, Katian Zhang. So I am so excited for her to be here. She is currently an assistant professor in international security at the Schar School of Policy at George Mason. She studies rising powers, coercion, economic statecraft, and maritime disputes in international relations and social movements in comparative politics, with a regional focus on China and East Asia. She bridges the study of international relations and comparative politics and has broader theoretical interest in linking international security and international political economy, which I'm sure will be appealing to many of you in this room. And her recent book, her very good recent book, I should add, with Cambridge University Press, examines when, why, and how China uses coercion when faced with issues of national security, such as disputes with the South and East China Seas, foreign arms sales to Taiwan, foreign leaders' reception of the Dalai Lama. So very timely things, I think we can all say. And her research has appeared in IS, the Journal of Strategic Studies, Journal of Contemporary China, many other venues, and among her many distinguished accomplishments, she received her PhD in political science with yours truly at MIT in 2018, and is also, I guess, a proud University of Wisconsin Badger. Thank you for being here. We're so excited to hear what you have to say. We'll do your questions at the end, and Katian will take it away.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Andrews, for the kind introduction. And it's great to see everybody and familiar faces. So today I'm going to be talking about my book, China's Gambit, The Calculus of Coercion. But before I begin, I would like to just to introduce to you my overall research agenda in case you're interested in some of my other ongoing research as well. So most of my research centers around trying to understand how a globalized economy affects Chinese foreign security policies as well as other rising powers. So within this theme, I have two major projects. And the first one is the book that we're going to be talking about today. But I also have empirical interest in issues such as coercion, as well as maritime, as well as land border disputes. And currently, I'm also working on a paper that evaluates the PLA strategy in Southeast Asia. But in more recent years, my research has evolved a little bit more so into trying to understand the overall means and ends of a state's, especially rising powers grand strategy. So within the second book project, I am mostly focusing on trying to compare China's grand strategy against historical rising powers, with the central hypothesis being economic interdependence is a form and structure that varies over time, and contemporary economic interdependence in the form of global production and supply chains has a simultaneous constraining but also enabling effect on China's grand strategy, making it different from historical rising powers. But of course, for the talk, I'm going to be focusing on the book, but I'd be more than happy to talk about some of my other research if you have interest and questions. So let's take a look at a data set that I've collected about China's coercion from 1990 to 2020. The gray bars that you see here are cases of China's coercion. And by coercion, I mean the use or threats of negative actions to demand a change in the behavior of the target state. So we can see that over the past 3 decades, the frequency of China's coercion has been on the rise, which is not surprising given how much power China has grown over the years. But what's more interesting is when we take a look at the tools of China's coercion. So same figure here, but broken down into different kinds of coercive tools, with the orange bars being non-military coercion and blue bars military coercion. So we can see that in the 1990s, China used military coercion about half of the time. An example would be the use of missile testing over the Taiwan Strait. And beginning 2000s, the frequency of China's coercion increased, but China has been overwhelmingly utilizing non-militarized coercive tools in lieu of military coercion. So an example would be the use of economic sanctions. So this is a banana ban that China imposed against Filipino banana exports to China over maritime disputes in the South China Sea in 2012. And another example would be the use of gray zone coercion. And in this case, it's the use of the Chinese maritime surveillance ship, the predecessor to the Chinese Coast Guard ship in the South China Sea as well. So there's variation and differences over the tools of coercion. And another aspect of China's coercion that also puzzles me would be about the targets of China's coercion. So let's stick with this South China Sea theme and take a look at an internal map that I got from the Chinese Academy of Sciences when I was doing field work a couple years back. The whitish area in the middle is the South China Sea, and the black dashed line that you see here is China's 9 dash line. Essentially, China claims all of the land features as well as maritime rights from within the 9 dash line. And towards the bottom, you're going to see some orange dots, and these are Malaysian oil fields. And there are a lot of them within the 9 dash line. And to your right, you're going to see one single purple dot, and that's the Philippine oil field. And there's only one within the 9 dash line. Now, the question for you then is, of these two countries, which would China be coercing more harshly and frequently? Let me see. Team Malaysia here, anyone? 0? Team Philippines? Oh, that's interesting. And the rest is, I still see like so abstainers. That is exactly like China's voting record at the UN, in case you're interested. But the answer is, I think a lot of you got it right. It's the Philippines. China coerced the Philippines a lot more harshly and frequently than it does with regard to Malaysia. But if you were me, when I was looking at this map initially, I was on Team Malaysia because of how many oil fields Malaysia has within the 9-dash line. But I was wrong. So the variation over the tools and targets of China's coercion led me to answer this central question for this book, which is when, why, and how does China coerce when faced with perceived threats to its national security? And in the book, I offer the cost balancing theory to explain China's coercion, placing coercion in an era of global economic interdependence, and argue first that China coerces one target state in order to deter other states from doing similar things that it does not like in the future. And second, argue that coercion is more likely when the need to establish a reputation for resolve is high, but the economic cost of coercing the target state is low. So by the need to establish resolve, I mean concerns about appearing weak vis-a-vis other states if no coercive action or threat is used. And finally, I would argue that China prefers to use non-militarized coercive tools when the geopolitical backlash cost is high. And by geopolitical backlash, I mean concerns such that if military coercion is used, then the dispute might escalate into a militarized confrontation. So this oftentimes leads China to adopt Goldilocks choices, that is, using coercion, but for fear of escalation, it kept it at the non-militarized level. So for the remainder of the talk, I'm going to talk first about the theoretical and empirical contributions of the book, and then I'm going to further define the concepts, such as coercion, and move on to describe or elaborate on the theory and the research design a little bit more, and use some empirical case studies in the South China Sea to illustrate the causal mechanisms of the theory, and finally briefly conclude and talk about policy implications. So the topic of this book, of course, is coercion, and there's a vast literature on coercion. Of course, this room that we're in is, the Tom Schelling room. So the literature, however, focuses mostly on evaluating the effectiveness of coercion once a decision to coerce has been made. And for those scholars that do study coercion decisions, some of them emphasize the role of domestic politics, but it remains to be seen whether this can also be applicable to China. And finally, there's this portion of the coercion literature that makes the argument prioritizing military coercion. So it's essentially sort of the costly sickening literature that argues that you either use coercion, go big, or go home, right? And however, it does raise the puzzle of why China will be using a lot of non-militarized coercive tools if they're considered suboptimal to military coercion. So the book really tries to theorize when, why, and how China coerces by adding a little bit more to the broader coercion literature. And in addition, the book also speaks to theories on rising powers. And the traditional literature on rising powers tend to explore big picture questions of war and peace, but this book is more so in line with some of the burgeoning literature on rising powers that examine the specific strategies and foreign policy behavior of a rising power while it is still in the process of rise. So think about our colleague Josh Schifrin's work on rising power strategies. And finally, empirically, the book also provides a first systematic analysis to China's approach to coercion, as well as a data set of China's coercion in the post-Cold War era. And hopefully, by understanding China's coercion rationale more, it'll help us understand better China's national security decision-making processes. Now, let me turn very briefly to the concept of coercion itself for a moment. And I define coercion as the use or threats of negative actions to demand a change in the behavior of the target state. And of course, I do acknowledge that in the strict Tom Schelling sense, coercion includes both compellence and deterrence, but for the book, coercion here refers to just compellence. And there's a full spectrum of coercive tools that states, including China, can utilize. So the first kind would be, for example, diplomatic sanctions. An example can be canceling senior level meetings or more extremely cutting ties completely. And second, states can also utilize economic sanctions. The banana ban is one example, but more extremely, one can use embargo as well. So what straddles these strictly non-military coercion and military coercion is what I call gray zone coercion. So it is the use or threats of civilian law enforcement organizations to inflict physical damage on the target state. And China's use of its maritime surveillance ship or the successor, the Coast Guard ship in the South China Sea would be an example. And finally, of course, states can escalate to military coercion. The missile testing is one example. Now that I've talked about the concept, let's get to the theory, cost-balancing theory, a little bit more in detail. So the theory answers two questions. First, when and why China coerces, and second, what tools is more or less likely to utilize. And let's get to the one question first. So the underlying assumption of this book is that in an era of global economic interdependence, coercion decisions are a result of balancing security and economic factors. So on the one hand, states care about external security. And if we follow the logic of the literature on reputation, resolve, and signaling, going all the way back to Tom Shelley and Bob Jervis, then China might feel the need and pressure to use coercion in order to demonstrate to the other states that it is committed and resolved to defend its national security interests. And might fear that if no coercive action or threat is used, then other states might interpret this inaction as unresolved. So this might call for the use of a coercion. But on the other hand, coercion does carry with it costs. And I would argue that the primary cost would be economic. So if we follow the logic of the literature on economic interdependence, commercial peace, and more recently, weaponized interdependence, then because China is an economically integrated state, and it's part of the global production and supply chains, then it has to take into consideration the potential negative economic consequences of using coercion. And therefore, coercion decisions can be visualized in a decision tree. So first off, China will need to decide the level or to measure the level of the need to establish a reputation for resolve. So if the need to establish resolve is low, we're more likely to see China refraining from coercion. But when the need to establish resolve is high, then China will need to consider the economic cost of using coercion on the target state. And if the economic cost is low, we're more likely to see China using coercion. Now, you might be wondering, what about the circumstances when the need to establish resolve and economic cost are both high? I argue that that's when the issue importance variable comes into play. So issue importance is the stakes that states attach to certain sets of issues. And empirically, in the case of China, there's a very strictly defined interest hierarchy with Taiwan and Tibet being the core interests, and Taiwan being the core of the core interests. And other issues, such as the rocks in the South China Sea, they're important, but they're not at the level of core interests. So I would argue that it's only when issue importance is the highest that we're more likely to see China using coercion. And when issue importance is lower, China is more likely to refrain from coercion when the need to establish resolve and economic cost are both high. And of course, in the book, especially in the empirical chapters on Taiwan, examine the issue importance variable a little bit more in detail. But for the talk, we're going to be zooming in on circumstances when the need to establish resolve and economic cost are not both high. So now let's turn to the second part of this question, which is about the tools of China's coercion. And here I argue that the geopolitical backlash is the central variable. And by geopolitical backlash, I mean concerns, or I follow the logic of the balance of threat literature. So if China is aware that other states could be balancing against itself by either forming or strengthening alliances with external great powers, empirically, for example, the United States, then it has to be concerned about the potential that if military coercion is used, then the target state might escalate the dispute into a militarized confrontation, especially by drawing in external great powers with whom the target state has mutual defense treaties with. So if China does not want a militarized confrontation, then when the geopolitical backlash is high, we're more likely to see China using non-military coercion. And when geopolitical backlash cost is lower, China has more room for maneuver to use military coercion. So this concludes our discussion about the theory itself, and now let's turn to the research designed to see how it tests the cost balancing theory. So essentially, in the book, I developed two qualitative methods, and the first one is congruence testing. And essentially, in all of the empirical chapters, I examined the temporal trends and variations in China's patterns of coercion to see if these temporal variations track with changes in the independent variables of the cost balancing theory over time. But I also adopt process tracing with detailed case studies and sometimes utilizing the most similar case research design methods, which I'll illustrate when we get to the empirical section. So it'll help us it'll help us better get at the causal mechanism. And in terms of issue areas, examine maritime disputes in the South and East China Seas and issues over Taiwan as well as Tibet, and in a separate article, not in the book, Sino-Indian land border disputes. Happy to talk about all of them, but for the talk itself, I'm just going to be focusing on the South China Sea. Now, you might be wondering, what about the pieces of evidence or sources that you utilize, for the book? Here we go. These are the, 50 pounds of books that I hauled from China after a trip in spring 2023 last year. And on top of it is a red study notebook for the Chinese Communist Party's 20th Party Congress. And of course, these books are too new for me to use for the book on coercion, but I am utilizing some of them for the second book on China's grand strategy. But I do utilize primary Chinese language sources of 3 kinds. So I'm going to talk about those primary sources first, and then when we get to the measurement section, I'm going to talk about the objective indicators that I also utilize to cross-check and triangulate. So first kind of primary Chinese language source would be official sources from government documents. On the left-hand side, for example, is a book published by the Chinese Foreign Ministry titled China's Foreign Affairs, annually going all the way back to 1987. And on the right-hand side would be a secret document from the Chinese Communist Party's Central International Liaison Department. And for the record, I did not steal this secret document from China, but it's actually already available at the Gambit Library at George Washington University. And there's a China Documentation Center in the library that you can utilize. It has a lot of internal sources, especially from the 1990s. The second kind of source I utilize would be semi-official sources, including government think tank reports. So on the left-hand side is an internal report from the Chinese National Institute for South China Sea Studies, which is under the Foreign Ministry as well as the State Council. And on the right-hand side would be some internal analyses from the Chinese Navy. And I got access to some of these internal documents or analyses when I was doing fieldwork in China before COVID. And finally, I've also conducted about 150-ish interviews in the 3 years of fieldwork that I've done in China, and about 45% of them were with Chinese government analysts, and about a quarter were with former civilian officials, and 6% were with former military officials, and the last quarter were with well-connected Chinese scholars who sometimes brief central leaders, including Xi Jinping. So these interviews are useful to me for 2 purposes. And the first one is that I use these different kinds of sources to cross-check and triangulate, so I'm not biased against one source over another. And secondly, some of these interviews contain useful information. And let me just give you one example. So I got to interview the captain of one Chinese maritime surveillance ship, and this captain was the person that led his ship into the disputed waters between China and Japan in the East China Sea. And I was able to gain invaluable information from just one interview. And that's an example of me doing interviews before COVID, meaning many years ago. So let's now get to the measurement section now that we've talked about the primary Chinese language sources to see how I measure the independent variables a little bit more comprehensively. So there are 3 variables of interest for the purpose of the talk here. And the first one is the need to establish a reputation for resolve. And the second is the economic cost of coercing the target state. And finally, geopolitical backlash cost. And in the book, I adopt a binary coding scheme that is treating them as either high or low, although I do acknowledge that in reality, things will be a lot more complicated. But just for theoretical simplicity, I kept the binary coding, but the empirical chapters do reflect a little bit more nuance. So let's get to the need to establish resolve first. And I use both objective indicators as well as speech evidence from primary Chinese language sources to cross-check. And there are 2 objective indicators. And the first one is the number of challenges from other target states. And by challenges, I mean things that the other states did that China considers as threatening to its national security. And a related indicator is the level of international media exposure of these challenges. So it's important to note here that I'm not capturing or tracking the international media exposure of China's coercion. Rather, I'm only capturing the international media exposure of these things that the other states did. And the logic here is that if we see an increase of these challenges from other states, and if these challenges themselves are heavily reported by the international media, think AP or AFP or Reuters, then China might fear that other states are all observing these incidents as well as China's or waiting for China's reaction or lack thereof. And if China does not take coercive actions or use threats, then other states might interpret this inaction as unresolved and weak. So the more challenges and the more media exposure of these challenges, the greater the pressure that China feels to establish resolve. And of course, I also cross-check with speech evidence to see if Chinese officials or analysts were expressing concerns about appearing weak. And second, onto economic cost of coercing the target state. And again, I use objective stats as well as speech evidence to cross-check. And in terms of econ stats, I examine whether the target state is a major export market for China, or whether the target state is a critical part of China's supply chains. For example, by offering China high-tech intermediate products or key technologies, things that China needs in its own domestic production but cannot produce itself, or whether the target state is a critical energy supplier to China, and finally, whether the target state is a critical official development assistance supplier, ODA supplier to China, which was especially crucial to China in the 1990s and early 2000s. And if the target state is any of the above, then the economic cost of coercing the target state would be much higher. And of course, also look at speech evidence to see how Chinese officials view its economic relations with the target state. And finally, on to geopolitical backlash cost. And I use two indicators here, and the first one, I'm not sure if you can see here, is general balancing backlash, in which I track whether the United States is forming or strengthening alliances with the target state. So this is more about long-term concerns about balancing. But I also examine the immediate war escalation risk, in which I examine the likelihood of the United States to get militarily involved in a dispute between China and the target state. So this is more about immediate concerns about a militarized confrontation. And if the likelihood is high, then the geopolitical backlash cost would be high. And these two indicators, general and immediate, they tend to go hand in hand as well. So now that we're done with the boring theory stuff, let's get to the empirics a little bit more to see how I test the cost balancing theory. And like I said earlier, we're going to be focusing on the South China Sea. So let's take a look at Figure 2, which tracks challenges from other disputants in the South China Sea from 1990 to 2020. Because for background, the South China Sea has multiple disputants, right? China, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, Indonesia, and the Philippines, and to a certain extent, Taiwan as well. So there are a lot of countries disputing certain features in the South China Sea. And these blue bars that you see here are coded as incidents, by which I mean actions taken by other disputants in the South China Sea. And it's important to note here that these actions are not necessarily actions that tilt the military balance of power in the South China Sea to China's disadvantage. And oftentimes, these are actions that are designed to strengthen the administrative control of these other disputants in the South China Sea on their sovereignty or maritime claims. So let me give you some concrete examples. And China views these actions as diminishing China's own sovereignty claims as well as maritime rights from within the South China Sea. So for example, in the 1990s, you're seeing this little bump here. And they tend to include examples such as Vietnam occupying a new land feature in the disputed areas in the South China Sea. And in between 2000 and 2005 or so, you're seeing a slight decrease here. And these tend to include actions that are way more demure and much less dramatic than compared to the 1990s. An example would be a Malaysian politician landing on a land feature that Malaysia has already occupied since the 1990s. And beginning 2007, you're seeing sort of an increase again here, and these tend to include examples such as the Philippines signing an oil and gas contract with a foreign company in the South China Sea. So same figure, but I added China's coercion in response to some of these incidents in red. So you can see that in the 1990s, China used coercion, but selectively, not responding to every single incident. And some of these cases of coercion were actually militarized. In between 2000 and 2006 or so, China refrained from coercion. And beginning 2007, You see China using coercion again and again, selectively, not responding to every single incident, and none of the post-2007 cases of China's coercion were actually militarized. So in the book, I use the congruence testing to demonstrate that these temporal changes and patterns of China's coercion track with temporal variation in the independent variables that we've just talked about. But for the talk, we're going to be zooming in on a paired comparison of two cases. The first one being the 2012 Scarborough Shoal incident between China and the Philippines, where China used coercion against the Philippines. But interestingly, the exact same incident took place in 2001, again over the Scarborough Shoal between China and the Philippines, where the only difference being China refrained from coercion in 2001. So let's get to 2012 first. So the Scarborough Shoal is this little red dot in the South China Sea, and in April 2012, Chinese fishermen were arrested by the Filipino Navy personnel for illegal fishing in the disputed waters. And China used coercive actions of three kinds, none of which militarized. And the first one being China used its maritime surveillance ship, again, predecessor to the Coast Guard ships, and by blockading Philippine Navy vessels from entry into the shoal. And second, China also used the banana ban that I introduced in the beginning, a form of economic sanctions. And finally, China also used diplomatic sanctions by canceling senior level meetings between Chinese leaders and the Filipino counterparts. So the goals of China's coercion in this case were twofold. The direct goal was to force the Philippines to withdraw from the shoal, but the broader goal was to enforce a policy of restraint on all South China Sea disputes. So through process tracing, I was able to show that the need to establish resolve was high in this case, but the economic cost of coerce in the Philippines was low, and China therefore used coercion. So let's get to first the need to establish resolve, which is coded as high in this case because of both objective indicators as well as primary speech evidence. So if we look at the number of actions or challenges from other states, there was an increased number of challenges by the Philippines as well as other South China Sea disputes prior to China using coercion. And these challenges or actions themselves were heavily reported by international media, including, for example, the Scarborough Shoal incident of April 2012 itself. So this is a photo taken by the Philippine Navy. The gentleman up front were the Chinese fishermen, and the gentleman in the back was the Philippine Navy personnel. So this photo was released by the Philippines to AFP prior to China using coercion. So the media exposure was also high in addition to the number of challenges that China was, at least as perceived by China. And this adds to China's pressure to establish resolve. And if we look at the primary speech evidence, the logic of establishing resolve is pretty similar here. So I'm just giving you some examples just to give you a flavor of some of the primary sources. So this is one semi-official source from Zhongsheng at People's Daily, which is the Chinese Communist Party's party paper in February 2012 that noted that if the Philippines viewed China's push for cooperation as a sign of weakness and continued to encroach upon China's legitimate rights, the Philippines had the wrong calculus. And guess what? The Philippines did seem to have the wrong calculus because China used coercion. And in the middle of the coercive action, the same source from People's Daily noted again that the Philippines should not view China as weak, and China could create a Scarborough model to stop the opponent and to deter future transgressions. So the use of one coercive action to deter future actions or challenges seems, or the logic seems pretty clear here. And it's also important to note that these two pieces of evidence took place before and during China's coercion, so it's not post hoc justification of China's coercive action. And finally, I was able to interview some former Chinese senior state ocean administration officials, those who were in charge of the Scarborough Shoal incident, as well as former military officials and diplomats. So the consensus among them was that China was facing pressure to establish resolve and feared being viewed as weak by other states, which might give the green light for others to take actions in the future. So the interviewees quote this ancient Chinese proverb to describe their logic, which is killing the chicken to scare the monkey, with the Philippines being the chicken and other South China Sea disputes being the monkeys. But if I were to paraphrase, I think it's more accurate to call it scaring the chickens in order to scare other monkeys in the South China Sea. But please don't ask me the relationship between the chickens and the monkeys. I don't know why they're related. It's just a lot of Chinese analogies came from the zoo. So the need to establish resolve was high in this case, but in contrast, the economic cost of coercing the Philippines was low. If we take a look at figure 3 here, which tracks Sino-Philippine trade as a total share of Chinese foreign trade from 1993 to 2014, with the blue line being percent of China's exports and red line imports. So we can see that Sino-Philippine trade constituted as a very small amount of overall Chinese foreign trade, at best about 2.5% or so, but in most of the years it stays below 1%. And in contrast, and Chinese officials knew well before coercion that Sino-Philippine trade was highly asymmetrical to China's advantage. So by 2011, China had become the Philippines' third largest trading partner. And in 2012, Sino-Philippine trade constituted about 30% of overall Philippine trade, but only 0.9% for China. So Chinese officials, including those from the Ministry of Commerce, noted that prior to coercion, that China could impose economic sanctions and isolate the Philippines while strengthening economic relations with other ASEAN countries. For example, they can buy more bananas from Thailand as opposed to the Philippines. And therefore, China used coercion. But remember that I mentioned earlier that none of the 3 kinds of coercive tools that China used in this case were militarized. And that, I argue, is because of the high geopolitical backlash cost. And in fact, I would argue that the geopolitical backlash cost for China to use military coercion in the South China Sea has been high since the early 2000s. So if we track the annual versions of the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs book, China's Foreign Affairs, the one that I showed earlier, there has been an increased concern about increased US efforts in Southeast Asia, ironically right after 9/11. So the Chinese Foreign Ministry's logic is that because of counterterrorism, Southeast Asia has become a strong foothold for the United States, noting in particular that the Philippines was designated by Bush Jr. as a major non-NATO ally. And this trend seems to be cross-checked by US national security strategy documents too, because 2001 was the very first time that East Asia, including Southeast Asia, was listed as a vital US interest in the post-Cold War period. And this observation is in line with some of the work that Nina Selov has done, who makes the argument through US government documents as well as interviews with former DoD officials that the US pivot to Asia happened during, not in the Obama administration, but actually went way back to the Bush Jr. administration. So at least these different kinds of sources track with one another. And the geopolitical backlash cost also manifests itself as high in the Scarborough Shoal incident of 2012. So I interviewed former PLA Navy colonels, and one of them noted that if China used coercion in this case, used military coercion in this case, the US Navy might be directly involved. And this concern is very much in line with some of the civilian diplomats, right, who worries about loss and escalation and costs. And finally, there were some internal assessments from Chinese Foreign Ministry affiliated analysts prior to this incident of 2012 that noted that as long as Chinese action was controlled and non-militarized, the United States would not get militarily involved in a Sino-Philippine standoff. So the Goldilocks logic that China was using is pretty clear here. Now, some of you might be wondering, what about, you've talked about 2012, what about 2001? So let me talk about why China refrained from coercion in 2001, because the exact same incident took place. Chinese fishermen were fishing in the disputed waters in the Scarborough Shoal, and they were arrested by the Filipino Navy personnel. But the only difference was that China refrained from coercion. And I would argue that the key difference has to do with the differential need to establish resolve, which was low for 2001. So if we look at behavioral indicators, the Philippines and others' actions in the South China Sea were way more demure and much less dramatic than compared to post-2010. And this is very much in line with the little dip that you saw in figure 2. And the level of international media exposure of these actions was way lower than in the post-2010 period as well. And if we look at primary speech evidence, there was one memoir written by a former deputy Chinese foreign minister, Fu Ying, who was Chinese ambassador to the Philippines at the time of this incident. And she wrote about this incident in her memoir, recalling that the Philippines' actions in the early 2000s differed from the post-2010 period, thinking or categorizing those actions as way more cooperative than compared to the post-2010 period. And that's why China refrained from coercion in 2001. But lastly, very briefly, for those of you who might have thought about voting for Malaysia, let me explain briefly here why China does not coerce Malaysia nearly as much as it did with regard to the Philippines. So again, the crucial difference here is the need or the level of the need to establish resolve, which was high for the Philippines but lower with regard to Malaysia. So if you look at Chinese interviewees' response, and the consensus among them is that the Philippines is the loudest in internationalizing or sensationalizing the South China Sea issue, whereas Malaysia was the smart one because it was silently making profits off of the South China Sea without internationalizing or sensationalizing the South China Sea issue. And if we track the media exposure on the part of Malaysia as compared to the Philippines, the media exposure was much lower. So the interviewee's concern is that the Philippines publicizes all of its oil and gas contract, and if China does not use coercion, then other states as well as companies might imitate the Philippines' behavior in the future, and therefore trying to coerce the Philippines a lot more. So this concludes our discussion of the empirics. And in the book, I do consider several other potential explanations, such as the role of individual leaders, or the role of bureaucratic interests or domestic politics, and nationalism, popular nationalism or state nationalism, and finally, offensive realism. In the interest of time, I'll skip over them, but in the Q&A, I'll be more than happy to talk about any of these alternatives. So to briefly conclude, the book examines when, why, and how China coerces other states, and I would argue that China oftentimes makes Goldilocks choices, balancing between the need to establish resolve and the economic cost of coercing, as well as taking into account the potential geopolitical backlash. And this seems to suggest to me that a globalized economy in the contemporary era provides both opportunities and constraints to China's coercive action. And this, I would say, is very much in line with some of my ongoing work on China's preference for forming strategic partnerships as opposed to formal alliances. And second, the book also suggests that coercion is oftentimes used by China as a signaling device. But in addition, China oftentimes demonstrates this compel and to deter dynamic, which is killing the chicken to scare the monkey, which blurs the line between compellence and deterrence. And third, the book also speaks or adds to the broader literature that moves beyond military coercion to look at non-traditional forms of coercion, including more recently gray zone coercion. And finally, in terms of conclusion, I would also like to add that linear power growth has oftentimes been used as an indicator for predicting rise in power behavior, but at the same time, it is insufficient to explain certain specific behavior of a rise in power. And we really need a little bit more nuance or beyond the power variable itself. And finally, briefly, for those interested in terms of policy implications, I think that there might be two. And the first one is that for the United States, the first one is that the United States might be better off by adopting a quiet rebalancing strategy in the Indo-Pacific. What that means is that do more, say less, right? Which might reduce the media attention, but at the same time increases China's geopolitical backlash costs. And second, I would argue that the United States would have more targeted economic leverage by keeping China in the global production and supply chains, by keeping China continuously vulnerable and dependent on key US technology, sort of using economic interdependence as more like nuclear weapons in the more deterrent sense as opposed to, say, compelling sense. That pretty much sums up my talk, and I look forward to, thanks for having me again. I look forward to any comments and questions and suggestions that you may have.
Oh, okay. Hello. Thank you for being here, Coercion. This is a really impressive project, so thank you for sharing it with us. I have one more theoretical question and then one empirical question for you. The first is about how you factor in China's growing power over time into this article, into your argument. In particular, like, what do you make of the possibility that the challenges by certain actors, at least, have increased or changed over time because of China's growing power? And then in addition to that, like, their need to establish resolve maybe has also generally increased over time because of their growing power, or do you think it has? So I'd love to hear you say more about that, because one thing stuck out to me about the media exposure, that it feels to me like that's probably increased in general over time because of China's growing place in the international system. So it would be great to hear you talk about that. I'm sure you have an answer. And then my empirical question is, what happens when their compellence attempts do not work? And does that happen? And what do they do?
Right, right. Should I collect more questions, or should I answer one question each and then? Yeah, yeah. We have a lot of time. Those are really great questions, and I think I'll go to the empirics first, and then get to the theory question then. So the empirical question is about, I guess, the expected effectiveness, or sort of what about the outcomes of coercion? Wouldn't hurt China if China uses coercion and then it fails? Wouldn't that have a devastating impact on China's reputation itself? I think this is very much a valid point, but there are, I guess, two layers to this question. The first one is that even if China's coercion, because first off, it's a little bit difficult to define what is effective and what is not.
Can I make a clarification?
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
actually curious about what they do if they fail. Do they escalate? Do they
Oh,
try
sorry.
again? Like, what's their response?
I see. I see what that's right. So at the same time, I think it's still related to sort of the effectiveness question. What we sometimes see in those, I guess, failed coercive attempts in terms of not getting what China wants, like the goals part, is that that I think is more so in the Sino-Japan case, where China wants to use racial coercion to sort of at least compel Japan to acknowledge that there's a dispute between China and Japan in the rocks in the East China Sea, because Japan does not deny that there is a dispute in the first place. So Japan still denies the existence of the dispute between China and Japan in the East China Sea. But what we see is sort of a continuous, interesting balance of China continuously using those patrols surrounding the rocks in the East China Sea, but not escalating. So they're not going to escalate in a way because of the issue importance, I think, because it's not Taiwan. It's not nearly as important as compared to, for example, Taiwan. So China's rationale is that it's not. It's not, the stakes are not high enough for China to further escalate. So in a way, we could say that in the Sino-Japan case, the use of coercion fails in at least getting Japan to acknowledge the existence. But I would say in a lot of these cases of China's coercion, the outcomes are a little bit mixed. So again, in Sino-Japan case, it's true that they didn't compel Japan to acknowledge the dispute, but at the same time, at least from some of my interviews, as I can see empirically too, with like the Chinese Coast Guard ship captains and members, the Japanese counterpart, the JCG, the Japanese Coast Guard, they actually start to take the Chinese Coast Guard a lot more seriously. So before China's use of coercion in around 2010, 2012 period, the JCG used not to really have any conversations and dialogues with the the CCG. But after 2012, both sides began, especially Japan, began to realize that they really need to manage or control escalation. So that leads to an interesting balance in the East China Sea, where both sides, they still use patrols, but at the same time, the situation became a little bit more balanced because Japan began to, I guess, recognize the potential coercive power of, say, the GCG. So I would say if we, I wouldn't call it complete failure, it's maybe like a 50% kind of a failure. But in some of the other cases where we might not necessarily say, observe a drastic change of the behavior of the target state, say in the case of Taiwan, the Pelosi visit, or say Taiwan's election, et cetera, the goal of China's coercion tends to be twofold. So of course they do want to the extent that they can, change Taiwan's behavior, or say U.S. Congress behavior, but I think realistically that might not be that possible, feasible, but at the same time there is this additional performative layer to China's coercion, which is that China used oftentimes economic sanctions, like little bans on citrus fruits or, I don't know, salmon in other cases, and that action itself, even if it does not compel a change in the behavior of the target state, can still be seen by other states around the world. And that, in a way, sends still a deterrent signal to other states for, say, potentially receiving a Taiwanese delegation, et cetera. So I think there is a performative aspect to China's coercion, which oftentimes does not necessarily mean that you have to change the behavior of the target state in order for coercion to have some signal effect in the future. And I have a related article that's forthcoming that examines China's preference in terms of specifically economic sanctions, in which 87% of Chinese economic sanctions actually were just the just do it model. What that means is that China prefers physical signals. I think precisely because they think physical actions are way more observable by other countries, which might send a clearer signal, even if they don't really parse out whether the target changes behavior or not. And in terms of media exposure, so media exposure, I think your point is that media exposure might just build up over time, but I think so I don't have for this, I might have the slides here. I don't know if I do. Oops, sorry. Oh. So in a way, I think it actually kind of comes up and down, and I don't have the post-2020 period sort of media exposure. That's the South China Sea, the case that we're looking at. I think it kind of actually goes down a little bit. And in more recent years, 2022, 2023, with the second trimestral, the sort of media exposure goes up again. So media exposure, I think, is not necessarily just a reaction to China's growing power. I think there is an element of it, but at the same time, a lot of these disputes in the South China Sea that we observe, I think they're very much local. For example, arresting the fishermen, a lot of it, I think the Filipino Coast Guard, they don't necessarily have China's overall power in mind. I think it's more about the specific disputes. For example, if they see a foreign fisherman in the waters, that'll mean a threat to the Philippines' claims on the sovereignty or the maritime rights within the region. So I don't necessarily think that China's overall power growth is a like a linear kind of a threat or a concern to these disputes in Southeast Asia, because we do see, I guess, ebbs and flows of these coercive actions. If I can just add one more point to this power variable, it's not necessarily the case that, because it's really difficult to define power in the first place, and it's not necessarily the case that China does not have power in the 1990s. I think what seems more interesting is that when does China have power, and to whom, and in what ways? And even in the 1990s, you could actually say that in some of the other cases that I'm looking at, China does actually have a lot of economic leverage with regard to, for example, France. Like in 1992, China actually used very harsh economic sanctions. I guess I view power not just in terms of capability, but also in a slightly more like a relational form, in terms of whether you have leverage or not.
Thank you.
I think we have it online.
Oh, sorry.
Hi, Ketchen. Thank you for your presentation. This question comes from Dr. Gallagher, who's attending virtually. She asked, one of your main policy recommendations was to do more frequent and regularized freedom of navigation operations. So wouldn't more frequent challenges make the Chinese government feel the need to respond even if media attention was low? And furthermore, wouldn't more frequent military activity also increase China's threat perceptions and incentives to not seem weak? So greater willingness to pay geopolitical costs for a geopolitical benefit.
Right. That's a great point. So I guess I should maybe specify a little bit more about how maybe we should do FunOps. The first point is that because technically U.S. do FunOps not just on China per se, right? Because there are a lot of disputes in the South China Sea. Vietnam, for example, the Philippines as well. They also have what U.S. considers as excessive maritime claims. And when the United States does FunOps, they also do FunOps on Vietnam. The Philippines and China. Is not technically singling out China. It's just that the media reports portrays these FunOps as if it's singling out on China. So I think if, say, the United States does increase the frequency of doing FunOps sort of equally distributed to these disputes in the South China Sea, that in a way reduces the perception that China is being singled out by the United States. And by extension, I guess my thought process or deductive process is that if FunOps are much more frequent and regularized, most of the time in a market-based system, it will not catch media attention anymore. And therefore, we will not see New York Times front page news saying, oh, the United States is doing FunOps against China, which technically is not accurate because the United States does FunOps on all disputes that have excessive claims in the South China Sea. Maybe more FunOps equally distributed, and once that it becomes so regularized, the media won't really pay attention to these FunOps.
Okay, sweet. Thanks, Gajun. This was super interesting, and it's really kind of unbelievable to see the project developed. Since I last saw it presented a long time ago, it's super good. I have three kind of broad questions, and feel free to pick and choose what you answer. The first is actually a question of kind of like logistics. Who's making the decisions about threat calculations now, or about how much of a threat these are, and is it changing over time, right? So we hear about Xi centralizing power. Is this actually leading to a centralization and decision about what a threat is? Because that potentially leads to a really interesting kind of implication for your argument, right, about how we might see changes in Chinese behavior with the variables generally staying the same. I really like that. And then the two second pits are kind of thinking about the broader compellence environment. So it would be, first of all, kind of useful for you to talk a little bit about how the Philippines viewed 2012. Were they surprised by the Chinese response? Were they expecting it and did it on purpose, right? Just kind of understanding the strategic environment, right? Because obviously this is a two-actor game, and you're coming from the Chinese perspective, but it would be really interesting to understand if the Philippines saw it in a similar perspective.
Right.
And then the third bit is kind of a broader question, but I think it's actually a really interesting question that you bring up a lot, or that you bring up, the book brings up a lot, right? And that, so obviously, I just taught about compellence last week in the Schelling room too, so I'm like you. But as we talk about, right, a major part of talking about compellence is assurances, right? That you actually have to communicate correct assurances for the target actor to believe that you're not about to just blow them out of the water. And so it seems like one of the major challenges that China has in this case is they're assuring, for example, in 2012, both the US and the Philippines. And right, those two things don't necessarily go together. It'd be interesting to hear a little bit about whether you think they're trying to balance the need to provide assurances to the broader geopolitical questions in addition to just the countries that they're looking at. Feel free to take whatever you want, but I'm really interested in the first question.
Okay, so I'll get to the first question then first, but I'll answer all three of them. So I guess the first question is a little bit about about decision-making processes, like who makes these threat assessments. Is it just about Xi Jinping? So first off, I don't think Xi Jinping does all of these like meticulous tracking of like national security strategies or other U.S. government statements or troop movement in Asia. So the agencies that I think are relevant in terms of making these threat assessments would be, for example, the Foreign Ministry and the Ministry of State Security, which I guess is sort of similar to CIA in a way, and the various think tanks attached to those agencies, as well as there's a specific think tank that's called the National Institute for South China Sea Studies, which reports to the Foreign Ministry as well as the State Council. So in terms of the actual documents, these are the ones that I think make the threat assessments, and then they're oftentimes elevated, as well as the State Oceanic Administration, which pretty much was in charge of the Coast Guard ships or the maritime surveillance ships. So these agencies, they make these assessments, and then oftentimes I think are elevated to the political apparatus. For example, my understanding about the 2012 Scarborough case is that these were long-term threat perceptions and assessments, and in addition, when a contingency like these took place, this case would be elevated to the Politburo Standing Committee. So I've had, I guess, interviewees from different geographical locations to sort of independently confirm that the case was elevated to the Politburo Standing Committee, which I guess is sort of the highest decision-making apparatus next to the president or the chairman of the CCP, and then they convene these meetings about what to do or what to take, what kinds of actions to take, or whether to use coercion in the first place. Of course, with the inputs from these agencies, so they use these threat perceptions or assessments from these agencies, but ultimately, in terms of the actual decision of whether to use coercion or not, for the most part, most of the time it comes from the highest decision-making body. And I would say even in the contemporary era, where Xi Jinping has a lot more political control than his predecessors, the decisions are still relatively in line with sort of a rational calculation of like economic costs or other kind of costs. There are exceptions. For sure. So the captain, remember, I talked about that I interviewed, this captain himself was the sole person that's responsible for China's very first entry into the disputed waters between China and Japan in the East China Sea in December 2008. And that action was not authorized. The Chinese premier at the time was visiting Japan, and I interviewed Chinese diplomats based in Tokyo at the time and Japanese diplomats based in Beijing at the time, and they were not aware of this thing. And apparently the Chinese government, like the central level, was very angry about this unauthorized entry, because that was viewed by Japan as highly compelling and highly threatening, and it was viewed originally by Japan as a government action. But in fact, it was not a central decision. So this captain, what happened to him, he was demoted. He was forced to retire very early, because otherwise he was an up-and-coming young captain. He would have made a lot further advanced. And that's why I think he was actually willing to talk to me, because he was very angry at the government's action. But I think in a way, his treatment was a domestic killing the chicken to scare the monkey kind of result, because there were internal regulations that suggest that the Coast Guards need to follow orders all the way from the center. They cannot act independently or on their own. So in a way, we do see some exceptions, but because of the I would say because of the coercive capacity of the Chinese government domestically, we actually don't really see that much actors gone rogue. And quickly on the how does the Philippines view 2012, or why, I guess, why do they do, so that Scarborough Shoal incident itself was not, or China's coercion of the Philippines was not, say, unexpected per se, because remember there were some red dots even prior to that. I guess the slight surprise for the Philippines was the magnitude that China used, or that Chinese coercion was on the Philippines. Because prior to that, I think it was the standoff was less long. And China didn't really use, say, economic sanctions per se. I think China used the 2012 Scupper Shell really wanting to create a model, basically, for, say, like future monkeys. The perception of the Philippines in 2012 was pretty negative, I would say. But that also has partially to do with China's action, but also has to do with domestic politics in the Philippines. Because I think that's the Aquino, the third administration, has had a pretty, I would say, more hawkish stance towards China than compared to the post-2017 administration, the Duterte administration. So the perception, I think, is partially because of China, but also partially because of domestic politics. And very quickly on the third question, whether China communicates assurances, I think that's a very good point. I guess it's not necessarily commuting direct assurances per se, where there might be private communications that I don't have access to, but China oftentimes in any of these cases uses a carrot and sticks strategy. So I guess you could sort of call this the carrots, the economic carrots, a little bit more of like a reassurances, as in if you don't do too much stuff, I'm gonna continue to give you. I'm gonna actually deliver economically. So that seems to be what China is doing to the Philippines in 2016, especially when China observes a administration change in the Philippines. China has been, I think, providing with the Philippines a lot more foreign direct investment, gambling, for example, which personally profits the Duterte administration and the president himself. Same thing with, I think there's the reassurance part that sort of manifests itself in geopolitical concerns. So part of the reason of why China also does not really coerce Malaysia as much, of course, Malaysia is like quieter, but at the same time, China also does not want to create a counterbalancing backlash among all of these ASEAN countries. So it sort of tries a divide and conquer kind of strategy, not direct reassurance, but I think there is this sort of a reassurance logic to some of the carrots that China has dangled to Southeast Asian countries. Sorry, Josh? Is it?
I think it was a question from.
I did have a question. Oh,
Please,
thank you.
please.
Oh, wow. Okay. Sorry, this is Dr. Jen, thank you so much for your talk. This is absolutely brilliant, as your previous colleagues have mentioned. I had two questions that were related to geopolitical backlash. The first being, do you think that China perceives any unintended danger or consequences of escalation in using gray zone coercion? And then the other one is, do you foresee an impact on China's approach to coercion with the perception of an unreliable United States, specifically in the South China Sea? Are there any other nations or institutions capable of levying a viable geopolitical cost?
Sorry, for the second question, you're saying if there's an unreliable U.S. administration, does that impact China's calculation of geopolitical backlash,
Yes,
right?
so you mentioned that geopolitical backlash seems to weigh pretty heavily on a United States response. So I just kind of meant, like, in the absence of an expected United States response, do you think that there would be
Like more coercion?
geopolitical backlash?
Yeah, I see. Both are great points. So first question on whether China perceives any unintended consequences or danger of actually using gray zone coercion. That's a really brilliant point, because I think there's a perceptual difference between how the Chinese think about gray zone and how U.S. leaders and those in the DoD think about gray zone. So China's, if you read the sort of the assessments or rationalizing of using gray zone in the South China Sea, it's mostly saying gray zone is actually plausible deniability. It reduces tension. It reduces the likelihood of escalation and U.S. involvement. But if you ask U.S. counterparts, they'll say gray zone, especially in the Navy, gray zone actions are highly escalatory. And I think there are scholars at the Naval War College, for example, that wants to advocate for the United States to categorize gray zone coercion as military use of force. And this, in a way, I think really leads to a dangerous unintended consequence of using coercion when China wants to use it to reduce tension, but it might actually be perceived as highly escalatory and dangerous by, say, for example, the United States. So I think you're absolutely right about the potential unintended consequence, because I don't really see that much in the Chinese writing about them actually realizing that gray zone coercion can actually be also escalatory, and their intention might not be perceived equally, say, by the adversary. But I should also add that at the same time, though, we're seeing sort of a learning process happening in the South China Sea, where Vietnam also has its own, I guess what's called like a fishery surveillance ship, which is sort of like the gray zone of the Vietnamese counterpart. Not that they use coercion, but they're sort of, I guess, in a way, using these taxes to potentially, hopefully, reduce tension. And in terms of what happens if the United States is sort of like unreliable, we're not really there in Southeast Asia, I would say we sort of saw that in the early 1990s when you see China actually using military coercion. That's when the United States left the Subic Bay in 1991 and 2, and when you read internal sources from China, the Chinese government, and think tanks, you'll see writings such as the United States left a huge geopolitical vacuum in the region. So in a way, I would say, if we either see a complete U.S. withdrawal from, not complete, but a relative U.S. withdrawal from the region, or a administration that is relatively unreliable, we might be seeing a Chinese perception of geopolitical backlash in the South China Sea to be relatively lower, which in turn might lead to more use of, say, drastic forms of coercion. And one related but not direct to China's use of coercion per se, I do have an article on land reclamation, and you can very much see that the Chinese government tracks, for example, the Trump administration's visit to Southeast Asia, which they noted was lower than Bush Jr. and Obama, et cetera. And they also track how the Obama administration approaches or makes statements about a commitment in the South China Sea, and China's land reclamation. In that article, I argue that started because it believes that the United States has a relatively lukewarm, or could have a relatively lukewarm response, particularly having watched U.S. actions or lack thereof in Syria and Crimea. And it wasn't until the second term of the Obama administration when Obama made a pretty clear red line about China should not reclaim the Scarborough Shoal, that China stopped reclaiming the Scarborough Shoal. Because in the original document that I found domestically in China, the Scarborough Shoal, the one that we talked about, was in China's land reclamation plan, but it was not reclaimed because of, I think, very clear red lines from Obama. So I don't know what's going to happen in the future if we have, a more unreliable president. Sorry, Josh? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Two questions relate to China's relations with India. So the first question is, there's been uptick in border standoffs between India and China. So how does China's cost-benefit logic applies on that frontier? And if there is any issue of importance that's concerning China. And second is about the kill chicken, spare monkey logic. So is its dynamics with India part of this larger power play game with the other regional adversaries?
Great questions.
Do you want to collect?
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Do you want to do a couple minutes? You're good? Okay.
Oh, there, should I? Oh.
Were there others? Anybody else? Okay.
Okay, so First off, on India, that's a great question. I think actually kind of relates to, I'm sorry, I forgot your name. A question on a geopolitical backlash, because with India, the geopolitical backlash is much lower than compared to the South China Sea, and partially because if you track, say, U.S. national security strategy documents, India is not as important as compared to sort of the more Indo-Pacific or Southeast Asia region, and you can see Chinese analysts, as well as I think I've interviewed former ambassadors, that make the argument that the United States and India are nowhere near to a formal alliance, and because of that, we're even taking into account Quad, it's not going to, it's basically China views it as useless to potentially deter or backlash against China over disputes in the border region between China and India. So the geopolitical backlash that China perceives to use military coercion in Sino-Indian land border disputes was actually much lower, and that's why if you compare China's coercion in the South China Sea post-2007 and China's coercion in the Sino-Indian land border area post-2006, you basically see just the PLA using coercion against India. So that's military coercion in the Sino-Indian land border region, and it has little to do with capability because there are gray zone capacities that China can have were used in the land border region. And there were, I think I had some internal documents as well as media reports about China potentially using boxing teams, like professional boxers, as the front line in the land border disputes, but they were never actually really called upon. It's just the PLA, because I think that has to do with the differential geopolitical backlash, which is much lower than compared to the South China Sea. And in terms of issue importance, border disputes, they're important, but these individual disputes, except for Taiwan, they're not China's core interests. So I would say the use of military coercion in Sino-Indian land border disputes has less to do with issue importance per se, but more so with the lower geopolitical backlash. If India and the United States form a formal alliance in the future that might include those border regions, we might be seeing China using gray zone tactics in that region as well. But that's at least that does not seem to be happening anytime soon. And on the chicken question, I think with India, the border disputes tend to be contained and compartmentalized. So I don't think there are, say, like other monkeys that China really wants to use coercion on India to scare. And that, in a way, is I guess it makes the Indian case a little bit more unique because with regard to maritime disputes, China's coercion on Japan or the disputes in the South China Sea, they're a little bit interrelated because they're of the same nature, maritime disputes. But with India, that is the only remaining dispute that China has with India. So whenever China uses military coercion, it's really more about deterring potential future Indian actions in the border region that China considers itself as changing the status quo or threatening.
Great. Well, right on time. I think we can thank Etienne for Dr. Zhang, I should say, for
Thanks, everyone.
We're going to take your hot mic off.
I forgot a pocket.
Oh.
Like I should have like a pocket.
Hang on.